Hello and welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. On today's episode, I was very excited to bring you the deck that I just made top 16 with over at Chaos Treasure Series 10. This is Narset Enlightened Master. I call this deck Bad Winota with Hexproof, and I'm super excited to be able to bring this deck to you today. If you like videos like this, make sure to hit like and subscribe over on YouTube, and make sure to be checking out patreon.com/comedianmtg, which we will be doing a restructure of in the very near future. Let's talk about our deck for today. So as I mentioned, this is a deck I made top 16 with over in the most recent Chaos Treasure Series tournament. This is Narset Enlightened Master, which, you know, if you were looking at very early days of cEDH, this was considered a cEDH commander, but has sort of fallen off the map from now until then. I went over to EDH Top 16 and checked any sort of tournament. So originally I had it featured by players 64 and up. And there was one other player who did well at the original Salt City event, which I did cover on this channel. And then I was looking at 100+ player tournaments, and suddenly this is the best result that's happened with Narset deck in a tournament of this size. So I'm very proud about that, and also very proud because I have always loved this card. For those who don't know, I actually started getting really into Magic right around Khans of Tarkir, and the Jeskai really stuck out to me as something I really enjoy playing between prowess and all these non-creature spells and stuff like that. So the fact that one of my favorite cards of all time was able to be a cEDH commander was really cool. And it's a commander that is definitely, I would argue, pretty spicy, because it is not a commander that has historically done super well in the past few years. Especially the format's gotten way faster, way more explosive. But Narset did get a few tools from here and there, and we'll kind of go through each category and explain what she does. I will caution people ahead of time, if you're interested in playing this deck at a tournament, it is really difficult. I'm gonna throw that out there. It is a difficult deck to pilot well, but let's read Narset. It is a 3/2 with First Strike and Hexproof, which most people knew, but there were definitely some people who did try to point some targeted removal at Narset throughout the tournament. But when Narset Enlightened Master attacks, exile the top 4 cards of your library. Until the end of your turn, you may cast non-creature spells from among those cards without paying their mana cost. So it only looks at 4 cards, and this is where the kind of confusing part about the deck happens, because sometimes you will flip over 4 insane cards from your deck, right? And then there were times when I would attack with Narset and flip over like a talisman and 3 lands, and your opponents would be like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, like you got there, expecting to lose that turn, right? So that is definitely one of the tougher parts of the deck, is sort of going with the variance that this commander has and sort of being able to pivot accordingly. I had several games that I won in which we were like, turn 0 was on the clock, and it was like the last turn of turns that would be available for me to be able to win the game. So it's not exactly easy to be able to convert to a win with this deck, because a lot of the times you win by setting up an infinite turn loop, right? But in standard cEDH protocol, an infinite turn loop is not declared as a definitive win con. So basically you have to actually kill the table in the meantime, which is one of the reasons I'm very happy the fact that I did actually put Underworld Breach into the deck. The easiest way to win with the Breach combo is the standard way of executing a Breach line, right? So you get your Lion's Eye Diamond and you get your Brain Freeze, and the idea is hopefully you've chipped away at your opponents a good amount before this point. And then usually having Blind Obedience on the battlefield, you're able to cast your spells over and over again using the Blind Obedience's Extort ability and drain the life from your opponents as you go through each iteration of that loop. That's the quickest way to like kill someone on that very turn. And I'm very glad, once again, I have that ability in this deck, because there were several moments during the tournament where I had tons and tons of extra turns, but I had no extra turns left in the game, in the sense of like, if I went to pass to myself, the game would have just ended, right? But the idea is you want to be flipping over non-creature spells that are, you know, because once again, you're only looking at 4 of them. You want to be flipping over big spells that are going to have a major impact on the game. I'm talking about the extra turns in this deck, and let's look at a few of them now. We have a bunch here, and if you're looking at these sorceries and some of the instants that we'll talk about in a bit, like Nexus of Fate and Savage Beating. Those are like the big ones we're flipping over from there, but these are also a ton of sorceries here and a couple enchantments and some artifacts that are just there to provide you a ridiculous amount of value. The best one by far is Enter the Infinite. It allows you to draw cards equal to the number of cards in your library. So you draw your entire deck, and then you put one card from your hand on top of your library, and you have no maximum hand size until your next turn. So, you know, obviously given what we just talked about there, and beforehand with our breach lines, you draw your entire deck, you assemble a breach line, and you don't even really need to like execute the breach part of it, but you just draw your entire deck, play a Blind Obedience, play everything out of your hand, and then if you need to recast things for more Blind Obedience triggers, you have the Underworld Breach, right? Which is able to create more and more mana and more Blind Obedience triggers to be able to kill your opponents on the turn you resolve Enter the Infinite. One of the things that's really nice about this deck is a non-creature spell that we really like is Teferi Time Raveler, right? So this card is a great Grand Abolisher that can be hit off of Narset, right? So you notice there's no traditional Grand Abolisher in this deck. There's also no Defense Grid. I felt like Teferi gave us a little bit more wiggle room than Defense Grid. It's also a removal spell attached to a Grand Abolisher, as opposed to Defense Grid, which I could easily see in this deck a scenario where you are forced to play Defense Grid and then pass, which is not what we want to be doing ever in cEDH, and especially not in this deck. We mentioned how much there's a bit of variance in this deck, right? So we don't want to be pushing for scenarios in which that variance can come back to bite us, which is more likely to happen with Defense Grid than it is with Teferi. Now let's talk about more of these large spells. We have one of the newer ones from the Commander Masters Precon, Rise of the Eldrazi. This one is a powerhouse. You can destroy a permanent, draw 4 cards, and take an extra turn. Now normally it is 13 mana, but with Narset it's obviously free, and once again the fact that it cannot be countered makes it such a huge player in this deck. One of our lands in the deck, Seagate Restoration, is also this huge spell that allows us to draw double the size of our hand +1. So that's really solid. Then we also have a bunch of extra combats and extra turns. Now, obviously Narset works really well with those because every extra turn you get, every extra combat you get, means she gets to attack one more time and look 4 cards deeper into your library. Now, the extra combats are good in the sense that, like, if you flip over a bunch of counter spells and 1 extra combat, you're able to still be able to free cast all of those counter spells to protect your non-creature spells, right? The extra turns are really awesome because you get an entire untap, you can hold up things in your hand, you get a draw step, you get all of those amazing things. But once again, you sort of lose all of the free cards you had in previous turns. So there's a lot of extra turn effects here. Capture of Jingzhou, Temporal Manipulation, Time Warp, Karn's Temporal Sundering, which is an extra turn and a bounce spell, Walk the Aeons, Temporal Mastery, Beacon of Tomorrow's Expropriate is just like super extra turns. Time Stretch is 2 extra turns, which I actually don't think I resolved the entire tournament now that I think about it. And then we have extra combat. So Seize the Day, one of the best ones because it has flashback too. It only untaps 1 creature, but guess what? The only one you care about attacking is Narset anyways. We have Fury of the Horde, we have Savage Beating here. Oh, we also forgot to mention Nexus of Fate. One of the biggest parts about Nexus of Fate, it is one of those things that allows you to have a pure extra turn loop and not deck yourself, because if Nexus of Fate is put into your graveyard from anywhere, you reveal it, shuffle it into your library instead, right? So you take an extra turn, and as you mill down your deck, if you aren't winning with the Blind Obedience loop like we talked about beforehand, Nexus allows you to just go to your next turn, take an extra turn, put on top of your library, attack with Narset, flip it over, right? Like all those stuff over and over again. Allows you to just loop Nexus of Fate and not lose the game because you're not drawing from an empty library, you're just casting Nexus of Fate over and over again. Some important things to realize when you're playing an extra turn deck: cards like Mana Vault and Mana Crypt and the One Ring can actually come back to bite you a little bit because they do make you take damage over and over again through a certain amount of turns, right? So that is definitely something to note. When you're going through those turn loops, those cards can have a decent bit of downside, so don't get caught with one of those being the thing that ends up killing you. Now, playing a bunch of cards through Blind Obedience saved me multiple times from that fate. That was one of the ways that sort of got out of there, and then the other ways are like being able to sacrifice and bounce your own permanents with things like Chain of Vapor and your own Rise of the Eldrazi and stuff like that. So that stuff is nice to be able to bounce and remove your own stuff. I did want to make sure I was playing a decent amount of interaction in this deck, right? The idea is that, yeah, you want to have a super consistent, clean, fast game plan to get Narset online, but you don't want to just also not have anything to, 1, defend your spells, stop you losing the game, a bunch of different stuff like that. So, I have a decent amount of counter spells in here, even going up to things like Spell Snare to counter 2 drops. I have a bunch of the classic 1-drop ones. No mental misstep in this deck because it felt a bit small for this deck. It's one of those cards where it's like really good when you're looking at like these micro things in the format, but I think I wanted spells that did a little bit more. Get Lost came in clutch multiple times. Love this spell, been loving it ever since it was printed. Delay Blast Fireball, obviously good to just cast from hand, but if it flips over with Narset, you're suddenly dealing 5 to all of your opponent's board and all of their creatures. It's also a different way that, like, if we need to get extra damage as we're going through that Blind Obedience loop, we can just loop Delayed Blast Fireball and extort it, and that's suddenly 3 damage every iteration of that spell. So that can also come up a little bit too when you're talking about that end game state. So there's a lot of ramp in this deck, right? We have a 6-mana commander that we want to get onto the battlefield with haste, right? So we have a bunch of stuff that we're trying to get our commander out, right? We have Ragavan early game, we have Dockside, Generator Servant, Simian Spirit Guide, Generator Servant, one of my favorite cards of all time. It's a 2-drop that allows you to sack it in the next turn, give it 2 mana, and give a creature haste, right? So just that's 2 mana for Narset that then automatically gives it haste when it hits the battlefield. Torch Courier is a quirky little dude, but you know, sometimes that's just the kind of card you need to be able to give haste to your creatures. We also have Lightning Greaves to be able to help on that account. Need for Speed, which is you sack a land to give a creature haste, which might seem bad, but when it is a 1-drop enchantment that you can play super early and then just have ready to give Narset haste for the rest of the game, it actually comes up quite a lot. And then the other one is the Hall of the Bandit Lord, which is the land that does that. Comes in tapped, which is obviously a little clunky, but you know, sometimes you need a land to be able to give Narset haste, and it definitely put me in a very solid advantage during multiple parts of this tournament. We also have a ton of artifact ramp here. Manifold Key is one I want to point out because yes, it is really good with your mana vaults, your mana crypts, your grim monoliths, stuff like that, and your One Ring as well, right? But the second ability is actually relevant here because it says 3 tap target creature can't be blocked this turn. So sometimes you will end up in board states where your opponents have things that have 4 toughness. I mean, Crom is a perfect example of that, right? But it's actually really funny that Manifold Key is an answer there. And especially if you're doing like that infinite turn Nexus of Fate loop, having a Manifold Key to be able to give unblockable to your Narset every turn is one of the ways you get around your opponents being able to basically stop you with blockers, right? One thing I'm doing in this deck that I don't really see done in other Narset lists is play a few important stacks pieces. So we mentioned Blind Obedience and how it's sort of an outlet for the end of the game, but it's also a tempo piece, right? It is buying you time. It's making your opponent's permanents come in tapped, which is actually really huge and super impactful on the game. I'm also playing Curse Totem to be able to shut down the creature combos in the format, right? This card came in super clutch multiple games during this tournament. I shut down a Dawnbreaker Thrasios deck completely. It stopped multiple creatures that were able to try to stop me from going off. It literally won me one of the games because 2 of my opponents had Glen Elendras on the field and we had like multiple people trying to jam Curse Totems, and finally one landed and stopped them. They didn't have enough to be able to get rid of it. And yeah, so Curse Totem was super huge. And then one that definitely I know from the complaints of my opponents won me multiple games was also Torpor Orb, or at least put me in good spot in multiple games. Many people were groaning as soon as this guy came down. Narset does not care about Torpor Orb. We have one effect in the entire deck that is stopped by it, and it's Dockside. And as much as I hate losing Dockside, it's so much worth it to not play around this one card in R99. And for the 0, very, very minimal chances there's that little bit of anti-synergy, it's so worth it to be able to play Torpor Orb to stop our opponent's Docksides, first of all. I mean, look at how many artifacts and enchantments we have in here. We have 19, and so 26 of those in general. And the fact that you stop your opponent's Docksides, you stop Thassa's Oracles, you stop so many good cards in the format with ETB hate. So Torpor Orb definitely put in a lot of work during this tournament. Mothering Tithe, very good in this deck. I don't really have to go too deep into that one, but put in a ton of work, especially with the 6-mana commander. And one with the multiverse. So I know a lot of people historically in this deck have played Omniscience, right? But the problem with Omniscience sometimes is you like play Omniscience, and then if you don't have a bunch of your bad giant spells in your hand, it doesn't really do anything, right? Whereas one of the multiverse also allows you to basically do the future sight thing where you're looking at the top of your library and you can play lands and spells off there. But once per turn, either from your hand or from the top of your library, you're able to cast a spell for free. So I had multiple times during this tournament where one with the multiverse resolved, I had like a turn spell in hand, I cast that turn spell. I also looked at the top card, there's a turn spell on top of my library, cast that for free, played some mana rocks and stuff like that off the top of my library to clear them so I wasn't drawing them with Narset or hitting them off of Narset triggers. The card put in a ton of work, and you know, when your commander cares about the top 4 cards of the library, turns out thinning out that top of your library and like optimizing what's on top of there is really, really powerful. It's also a card that just allows us to cast Enter the Infinite for free if we get it stuck in our hand, which did come up during one of my games. The two cards I'm most doubtful of after playing the tournament are Cataclysm and Tragic Arrogance. The cards are so powerful, but I feel like they are holdovers from a period of cEDH where Cataclysm effects were like actually pretty crazy. Like it feels like oh, well, Narset flipping into a Cataclysm is great because it wipes the whole board. And I definitely did have a scenario where I did cast a Tragic Arrogance and my opponents needing to interact with that spell did win me the game. So I'm not saying that they're completely bad and like they're instant cuts from the deck, right? Tragic Arrogance specifically allows you to choose your opponent's permanents they're keeping, right? So you can say like, okay, Tragic Arrogance resolves, you're gonna keep your Esper Sentinel as your only creature and your only artifact, and then you can keep one enchantment, and that's it, right? And then you completely blow out a very developed board state, especially once again, we're in this grindy mid-range meta, so it's a really good time to be playing cards like this, right? That part of it is very strong. Cataclysm gives your opponents the choice, but it also makes them go down to one land. The problem I found is that I actually like having lands in this deck. I think historically people were like, oh, well, Narset doesn't need lands, you can cast stuff for free, but it's like, I like holding up my counter spells. I like being able to play turn spells from my hand after I draw a bunch of cards. I like having all of my artifacts and stuff like that. So these cards are game warping. They are very powerful, but they do have downsides. And so it's worth kind of noting that that's the case. I also want to highlight Waves of Aggression here. This is a extra combat effect in this deck, but it also has Retrace, and it really allows for some very powerful looping. Basically, 5 mana, you throw away a land in your hand, and you can cast this card from your graveyard, which comes up a decent amount. You can free cast it off Narset. They'd be like, okay, go to my next combat. I just have 5 mana in my next main phase. Here, we're gonna do the Waves of Aggression thing again. And it's one of those cards that allows you to go from like, I have like 1 Narset, maybe an extra turn. And it's like, now I'm starting to go like multiple combats per turn and be able to just change my position from I could win the game here to I'm winning the game here. So as I said before, this deck is super fun to play. It is not like so many cEDH decks. It's this big over the top crazy deck, right? You're casting 13 mana spells and you're flipping over your commanders and you're playing cards like Enter the Infinite and trying to draw your entire deck in one go. But it's a hard deck to play. Genuinely, it is. Knowing when to play Narset, when to play Narset with haste, when to take the turn off to hold up counter spells, when to not overcommit to the Narset plan. All of that stuff is really huge, right? There are times when I would go to combat and there'd be Rhystic Studies and Mystic Remoras, and I'd go and I'd flip over a bunch of mana rocks with Narset, and I'd have to make that judgment call of like, do I want my mana rock so that next turn if I draw a turn spell I cast it, or do I want to be feeding these people all these cards? How do I play this deck without going super greedy? And the deck actually grinds better than it looks like it does, because you do still have access to things like the One Ring and Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora and stuff like that. So, you know, you don't have to always just attack and win the game that turn. It's great when that happens. There were times in this tournament where I attacked, flipped over the nuts, and like pushed for my win, right? But you're also flipping over non-creature spells, right? Which for a lot of these, like sorceries and instants and stuff like that, people have counter spells for, right? So the idea that like you just attack with Narset once and win the game is not true, right? And like some of my losses definitely came from that scenario, which was just, you know, I would go for these wins and they just wouldn't get there. You also do have to realize that the deck is, you know, it's a 6 mana creature that you want to have haste for. So you do kind of have to have Narset online for that to really start chugging, right? So it's never going to be like the turn 1, turn 2 deck of the format. That's not really what it does, right? But it can start to press its advantage pretty early on. I think I pushed for a win on like turn 3 was one of my fastest wins, because I just like had a hasty Narset with a bunch of fast mana and like went for it. I don't even know if I like won that turn, but I started pushing for the win early on through that sense, right? One of the good parts of the deck is, I did mention, your stuff can get countered, you can be stopped pretty aggressively, right? But Narset does keep pushing, right? That is one of the best parts about the deck, is like you can be stopped, you can be stopped, you can be stopped over and over again. And as long as the board doesn't get wiped and Narset doesn't cost you like 10 mana, you do have a chance of being able to win the game. And that's why I did mention down here with these stacks pieces, they do give you that time, right? I think they're super important to the deck, and I would definitely be looking for more, not more to just jam into the deck, but definitely keeping 1 or 2 more just to kind of like add a little bit more, buying myself that time, right? With pieces like, you know, I'm not gonna name any here because I haven't been able to test any cards for this deck, but you know, things like Pithing Needle and stuff like that to like stop my opponents being able to combo off with their decks. All that being said, this deck was so much fun to play. Like I had a blast playing this list. It is, once again, it's not like anything else in cEDH right now, right? You're playing this giant hexproof commander that's super cool and does the big boy winter thing, right? You have this giant 6-drop, but you're also going to combat flipping over giant spells. You're flipping over 13 drops and 7 drops and just drawing half of your deck or drawing the entire deck, taking 7 extra turns in a row. I remember I literally had this Infinitoken here from the tournament that I just wrote extra turn on because at multiple points, I think the most I had in a row before I won the game was like 7 or 8 extra turns in the bank, just being like, we're getting there, but we're still pushing it. And it's also cool because despite you having to go through the extra turn thing, your opponents are still engaged in the game, right? Like a lot of the times there were really interesting conversations about like, when do I counterspell? Which spell do I counterspell? You know, this turn you flipped over 3 counterspells, so I know he's played 2 extra turns in a row, but like maybe we should just be fighting for it on his next extra turn because he probably won't have as much interaction on that extra turn, right? So if this is a deck that you're interested in, give it a spin. It's so much fun. Can't stress enough, very difficult to play though, especially in a timed event, right? That is the biggest downside, is that it's a deck where, you know, I had multiple times where I was like, okay, I need to take like 5 turns before I can actually win the game. So I've got to do these at blisteringly fast pace. You know what I mean? Playing my spell going, okay, does everyone pass from the table? Pass, 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 great. All right, moving on to the next thing. Play this spell, pass, 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 great. Or we're gonna move on. And you have to make a lot of decisions in that bullet time section. So definitely a tough deck. Definitely puts you in some of those positions for sure, but yeah, super rewarding and super fun to play as far as that's concerned. Definitely a deck that I am gonna have a hard time taking apart for quite some time because it was just so unique and so fun. And I definitely have a considering board in my primer version of this list where you can see a decent amount of the cards I've thought about like keeping in, including, taking out, all that kind of stuff. And it's, yeah, just a unique way to play cEDH and something I'm really, really proud of playing, and definitely a super quirky list. So yeah, this is my time playing Narset. I think we can look at a couple hands just to give you all a rough idea of like what kind of hands I'd be keeping in this deck, and then we can wrap things up. Before we go into the mulligan process though, I'm gonna remind you that here at Comedian MTG, we do cEDH coaching as my full-time gig. So if you're interested in receiving cEDH coaching, feel free to reach out to me at my email, comedianmtg@gmail.com, at comedianmtg on Twitter, and comedian_mtg on Discord. Any of those places I'm available, and they are in the description of each and every video. Please feel free to reach out to me there if you're interested in coaching. And, you know, I gotta say, I've been pushing this year to revive dead decks, to push the boundaries with what is playable in cEDH. You know, I feel like between December, bringing back Derevi, running back a new and updated version of my Dawnmaker Thrasios, the tournament before this, playing Narset, a deck people were not talking about at all anytime recently, except for like the one, once again, the Salt City event. And, you know, just pushing the boundaries as far as cEDH decks and trying to explore the format. I love brewing, I love exploring these new commanders. Some of my favorite coaching sessions we do in this channel are brewing new decks and stuff like that. So definitely reach out to me if you're interested in any of that cEDH coaching. You know, I have some of the highest results with different decks of the past several years. And so if you're interested in that, reach out to me. All right, so we're looking at a hand here. So we'll do our turn order here on the Moxvale playtester. We're going 3rd in this pod. I gotta say, a hand like this has no acceleration, just have a need for speed, a bunch of counter spells, and a bunch of extra turns, so ship it away. Our second 7 here, we got a Mox Opal, no other artifacts, so that makes the ramp part of this a little awkward. Yeah, turn 2, we can get out a Generator Servant, but it's not even really guaranteeing me that we get that turn 3 Narset. There's not a bunch of other acceleration here, and kind of relying on blind obedience to not lose the game and nothing else seems pretty rough. So I think we have to go down to 6 with this hand. Okay, now we're starting to cook here. This is a turn 2 Narset, which I definitely do not hate. Yeah, turn 2 Narset's definitely where we want to be. I don't love how interaction light this hand is. We'll definitely put one of our larger spells to the bottom of our library, probably the Rise of the Eldrazi. Because as much as I love that card, I want to be flipping it off the top of my deck, not just playing it normally. So turn 1, we can just play the Mana Crypt in the land, hopefully draw something that's a little bit of gas these early turns. A lot of the times with this deck, I don't reveal all of my fast mana early on, because I don't really want my opponents to know exactly what's happening with me and to be able to predict what I'm doing. Now, worth noting, you cannot play the Ancient Tomb in these first 2 turns because you do need the 3 colored pips to get Narset out. So Mana Crypt accounts for the colorless mana, and we have 1 land, 2 land, Jeweled Lotus, and Mana Crypt will get us that turn 2 Narset, hoping to swing and start putting pressure on the table as early as turn 3. Definitely gonna be happy with this keep. All right, going forth here, we have a pretty slow hand. It's a turn 1 Curse Totem, which definitely could be a lot worse. We might break drop in the hand, but then we have a 6 drop, an 8 drop, and not really much else going on here. No acceleration to get out that early Narset apart from the Chromox, so we gotta ship that away. Oh, this one's pretty interesting. It's another second 7 here. We have a Ragavan. We are able to basically make 4 mana as early as turn 2. Actually 5 mana, which is not bad, but I don't want to do a turn 3 Narset. I don't love Rise of the Eldrazi in my opening hand. I don't want to rely on Ragavan flipping us into fast mana to be able to make a hand happen. So it's really struggling to get our game plan. Plus it would be a turn 3 Narset without haste. So I think we got to go to a 6 here. This is a no-lander. But crazy enough with this deck, I do consider these hands sometimes because if we hit a land drop here, that is a turn 1 Narset. So like, there are certain insanely greedy hands in this deck that are kind of worth keeping. I will say the 1 Lion's Eye Diamond hand I did keep during this tournament, I almost got completely blown out on. So that's something worth noting, right? People will Force of Will Narset. I definitely have explained to people that, you know, that's not always the move to do, but, you know, sometimes they don't want to believe you, and especially not if it's turn 1. So I could actually see myself keeping this 6 and just hoping we hit a land drop to crack the LED and pray. And now because I'm curious and not because I definitely want to keep this hand, I'm just going to click that draw button and we hit the land for the turn 1 Narset. So like, come on, it's so cool. All right. Or in case anyone's not understanding what I mean by turn 1 Narset, we do Plateau, either Chromox, doesn't really matter which one we exile. Probably want to exile like Temporal Mastery just because it exiles itself, and we want a blue mana here. That's 3 mana, then we have LED. So we crack our LED, pitch our entire hand, that's 3, 4, 5, 6. Turn 1 Narset. Seems pretty good. We don't have a hand. If we get hit with the Force of Will, we're not playing the game, but like, turn 2 Narset with the ability to flip over some spells is pretty nasty. So if you play out a hand like that, right, we get a land drop here, which is pretty nice. And then if you swing in with Narset, what do we get? Got a Path to Exile, another turn, a Mox Diamond, and an Enlightened Tutor. This is pretty cool indeed. I think if I'm playing this pod, I Enlightened Tutor probably for like a Jeweled Lotus. I know that might seem a little bit weird. The other option is like a Mystic Remora, but the idea here is that you're trying to rebuild in case something happens to Narset and in case this capture does not pop off, something like that, right? So I'm down to tutor for something like that and then take this extra turn. Okay, so say we tutor for a Jewel Lotus, just to keep it nice and safe, and then that goes graveyard, and then these guys stay in exile. Assuming we haven't cast a path on somebody's stuff. We go to that next turn. We draw the Jewel Lotus for the turn, attack with Narset again. I'm going to retrack Cataclysm, Chain of Vapor, and Odawara. So this is exactly one of the scenarios I was talking about where like we lose all of our development if we go for the Cataclysm, you know, immediately punished for playing that Jeweled Lotus pre-combat. So, but this is one of those times where it's like, yeah, it probably disrupts our opponents pretty decently, but it's not like they have huge board states starting on turn 2 as it is, right? And this is one of those things where Cataclysm is like really good if we're hosing an entire board state, but right now we just have a protected Cataclysm on this turn. We don't set ourselves up for extra turns and things like that. Actually, one thing that's actually kind of nice is that we do have the Chain of Vapor here, so we can actually bounce our mana rocks before the Cataclysm, which is pretty funny. But all that being said, this flip is pretty okay. And this is kind of what I mean with the deck is like, you don't always just like chain turns into extra combats into stuff like that, right? Is sometimes you are just getting some of these really high value flips, right? You get 4 free cards or, you know, between 1 and 4 free cards a lot of the time. It's very few times that you're hitting, you know, all land drops. That's just why we only play 26 normal lands and 1 MDFC in the deck. But that's sort of what happens sometimes. Is like you have this big amount of potential variance in it, right? Like I definitely had a flip where it was like 3 lands and a Grim Monolith, right? And then I had another one where it was extra combat, enter the infinite, counterspell, right? So it's like, what? There's so many ranges that are potentially possible for this deck. All right, we'll try and get one last hand here to sort of signify the stuff that you're trying to keep with this list. This one, and let's see, oh, sorry, what turn order, where are we? We are going first. All right, Narset on the play is something I like to see. So we have a Manifold Key and a Lion's Eye Diamond here with this opener, not really able to ramp at all, so chip it away. 2 lands, no acceleration. Yeah, we have a Force of Will, but we're not doing anything. We're going down to 6. Okay, this one's marginally interesting. We have the ability to turn 1, we do Ancient Tomb into Signet, turn 2, play a land, play the Felwar, play the Lightning Greaves, and then that should give us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So enough for a turn 3 Narset with haste, which isn't bad by any means. And once again, we're going on the play too. Any draw is pretty much gravy from here, especially if we draw some more fast mana. So, you know, Lightning Greaves definitely makes this hand keepable when otherwise it would probably be a practiced mulligan. And then, you know, maybe if we happen to draw 2 red cards in a row, we can also just play our Free Fury of the Horde, not even including our Narset flips, which is pretty cool. Yeah, so I don't know if y'all can tell, I really, really like this deck. It's been so much fun to play. Once again, this is one of my favorite commanders of all time, and the fact that I was able to bring it to a cEDH tournament has me elated. It's been so much fun to play this deck. It's been a great experience, been super cool. It's not like other cEDH decks because of what a unique axis it attacks the format in. You're playing big, stupid spells, you're flipping over stuff, you have this very untouchable commander here in a Bowmaster's meta, which I do really like about this deck. And you do just the craziest things, right? It is really insane. Once again, for the 100th time I've said it this episode, not an easy deck to play at a tournament, especially when it comes to tournaments that have a small round timer, right? The Chaos tournament I was at is a 90-minute round timer. I could easily see me having brought this to an 80-minute round timer tournament and it just not being a thing, right? I will say online tournaments do naturally progress a little slower, so I don't think that's as much of a problem, but still, definitely a possibility there for this commander in this deck, but it was so much fun to play. I definitely suggest, if you have any interest in this commander, pick it up, play it. It's a great time. It is a blast to play, and yeah, I'm super proud of this one. I've been really excited every time I've been able to take a commander that people don't take seriously in cEDH and really push it to what I consider some of the highest levels of its possibilities. So it's really cool. I'm super happy to have top 16 with this commander, and yeah, it's been super fun. The deck list will be down in the description below, and it's definitely one that I'll be working on from time to time for sure. And hopefully I can, you know, show up with this super sick commander from time to time. Thank you all for watching this video. Were there any cards in this deck that you were surprised by? I mean, I know the very notion of this deck topping is something that's gonna surprise people in general. I'm super geeked about this deck. Let me know in the comments below if you have any thoughts on this commander, if you have any interesting observations or any cool cards that are not in this list that you think should be in there. Thank you all for watching this video, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.
Do you lie awake at night? Are you afraid to turn out the lights? Is there something you're scared